get started so that we can have the last of the people who are outside come in. Just a couple more minutes. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. I'm Vidita Vaidya. I'm a neurobiologist here at TIFR, but I also wear the hat of being the convener of TIFR's Art and Archives Committee. We welcome you to this, the second of our Art and Archives Colloquia series. Our first speaker is actually right here with us. Mort gave a fantastic talk last year, and we're very excited to have this, our second of our series, and that Professor Naman Ahuja is going to give the second of our colloquia. So let me tell you a little bit about us. We're known, of course, as a national center of the Government of India for fundamental research, spanning from nuclear science and math to biology and also ecology. We also happen to be custodians of one of the finest collections of post-independence Indian art. And we also have a remarkable collection, limited though it is, in antiquities. It's our pleasure today to have with us Professor Naman Ahuja as the speaker of this second Art and Archives Colloquium. And we welcome our chief guest, Professor Mahesh Devkar, along with his wife, Dr. Lata Devkar, who are here with us from SPPU in Pune. Professor Devkar is an expert in Buddhist studies, and it's a real honor to have you both with us here as our chief guest. I'm going to hand over to our Master of Ceremonies, Oindrila Chaudhary. Oindrila is the face of Art and Archive. She's literally held it together over the past decade and a half, preserving one of these wonderful collections that we are custodians of, and she's going to be our Master of Ceremonies today. So, Oindrila, take over.
Thank you, Vidita. On behalf of the Art and Archive section of TIFR, I extend to you all a warm welcome to our second Art and Archives Colloquium. May I request our dignitaries, Professor Jairam Chengalur, Director of TIFR and Chairperson of the Art and Archives Committee, our Chief Guest, Professor Mahesh Devkar, Head of the Department of Pali and Buddhist Studies and Dr. Ambedkar Thoughts at Savitribai Phule Pune University, and Dr. Lata Devkar to kindly join us on the dais. We are deeply honored to have with us our speaker for today, Professor Naman Ahuja. Professor Ahuja, may I request you to please join the others on the dais.
Hello.
So much about you.
And now, may I invite our director, Professor Jairam Chengalur, to say a few words.
Thank you, Oindrila. It's a real pleasure
to welcome you all to the second Arts and Archives Colloquium at TIFR. As you probably know, TIFR was founded just prior to independence, and the vision of our founding director, Dr. Homi Bhabha, was to create a world-class research institute in Mumbai. Dr. Bhabha was clear that in order to create an institution of excellence, you needed to not just have talented and highly motivated faculty, but equally importantly, one needed to create an ecosystem in which such people could flourish. Such an ecosystem would include providing a physical environment that was aesthetic and conducive to creative work. In practice, this translated to his placing emphasis on the location as well as architecture of the institute buildings, the design of the gardens, as well as engagement with the world of art. Dr. Bhabha's wide-ranging interest in the arts is something that found a strong response in many of the faculty of TIFR, and TIFR has had a long history of engaging with both the fine and the performing arts. Another long-standing tradition at TIFR is our commitment to engagement with the public. We have a dynamic outreach program, including a very active series of public lectures by faculty, eminent scientists. Just last week, we had an amazing lecture by Professor Bonnie Basler on how diverse microorganisms communicate with each other using the language of chemistry. And earlier this week, we had a fascinating lecture by Dr. Priscilla Cushman on dark matter detectives. In addition, we also have a regular Chai and Why series of talks, which runs every alternate Sunday at the Prithvi Theatre in Juhu, where our faculty and students present in accessible language some of the cutting-edge work being done at TIFR. I would encourage those of you who are interested to please check out our web pages and social media feeds for more details. Today's event is a different aspect of this tradition of engagement with the public and the world outside academia, namely our engagement with the Mumbai public on the arts front. For some time now, we have been working on revitalizing this engagement via a whole range of activities, including the Arts and Archives public lectures, of which this is the second edition. I'd like to say something about the organizing body for today's lecture, namely the Arts and Archives section of TIFR. I want to particularly draw your attention to the second half of their title, Archives. And that's something that we won't be looking at a whole lot today, but I did want to say something about it. This group of people look after not just TIFR's art collection, but also the TIFR archives. TIFR has arguably one of the best archives in the country regarding the development of modern science in post-independence India. It includes material on the development not just of the fundamental sciences, but also the nuclear program, the space program, digital computing, and a whole host of other initiatives. Some of you may have already noticed that outside the auditorium, we have a permanent exhibition focused on Dr. Bhabha and TIFR. I would encourage those of you who have not seen the exhibition earlier to please take a look after the lecture. TIFR and the TIFR faculty have played an important role in shaping the scientific trajectory of post-independence India, and the TIFR archives are a unique record of these fascinating times. It's a treasure trove of information for both the public as well as scholars interested in the development of science in post-independence India. But coming back to today's talk, which is on the very current topic of the treatment of antiquities, it's a very great pleasure to welcome Professor Naman Ahuja, who has worked very extensively in this area. We are delighted to host him at TIFR. We are also delighted to welcome Professor Mahesh Deokar, the head of the Department of Pali and Buddhist Studies at the Savitribai Phule Pune University, who will also make some opening remarks shortly. I'm sure his remarks would give us the broader historical and cultural context for the talks to follow. I'm deeply grateful to them both for making the time to be with us today. This brings me more or less to the end of what I had wanted to say. Welcome again to what I'm sure will be a fascinating and informative evening.
Thank you.
TIFR is honored to welcome Professor Mahesh Devkar from the Savitribai Phule Pune University. There, he heads the Department of Pali and Buddhist Studies and Dr. Ambedkar Thoughts. Professor Devkar is a renowned scholar of Pali and Sanskrit. His areas of specialization include comparative grammar of Pali and Sanskrit, Theravada, Buddhism, contemporary Buddhism, as well as translation and editing. He has been actively engaged in teaching and research in the field of Pali and Buddhist studies. Last year, Professor Devkar was conferred with the prestigious Prachya Vidya Vidushan, jointly awarded by Central Sanskrit University, New Delhi, National Sanskrit University, Tirupati, and Lal Bahadur Shastri National Sanskrit University, New Delhi, in recognition of his outstanding contribution to Pali and Prakrit studies. May I now request Professor Devkar to say a few words.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Honorable Chairman of this lecture today and the Chief Speaker, Professor Naman Ahuja, all the members of the Art and Archival Committee and the audience. I'm indeed happy and privileged to be here to share some opening remarks for today's talk. I'm especially happy that Mrs. Godrej is here personally for this talk, and as it was indeed a kind of a cherished dream, because when we heard about this Piprahwa relics and basically some of this the parts of it coming back to India with efforts of Godrej family, and today she is here, so I feel that's a really great moment and a great moment of joy, and also I really feel honored by her presence. I'm basically going to say a few words from the point of view of my literary study of Buddhist material, which is available in 4 classical languages: Pali, Sanskrit, and then in the translated form in classical Chinese and classical Tibetan. Now, if we look at the Pali records, I mean, that's the earliest one which we have at present. There is a discourse called Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which describes the last journey of the Master Buddha. And in that long discourse, at the end, there's a description of his passing away, and then the rites, the funeral rites which took place after that. And we learn from the discourse that the Buddha says that he was a master, he was a king of righteousness. We are called Dhamma king, the Dharma king, and he should be then cremated, following the ways in which the kings are cremated. And we had this grand funeral. This is how the text describes it, and it says that afterwards his remains, bodily remains, were then collected and distributed. It is said that there was this Brahmin called Drona who conducted all the funeral rites, and then the share of his bodily remains, which we call as Sharira Dhatu or Sarira Dhatu in Pali, these are the bodily remains elements which are shared. Now, it's very interesting that even in the lifetime of the Buddha, we know that there were his followers, devotees, and they always wanted to have some kind of memories of him in different forms. So actually, we are also told that the king Parsenadi of Kosala kind of wanted to create an image of the Buddha so that they won't miss him when he is on his journeys. But after his passing away, I think it was a thought that his bodily remains should be preserved, mainly for two purposes. One is for his memory. And the second is that these bodily remains, because these are bodily remains of a person who has achieved the highest state of his spiritual life, and it was considered that they have a special power. They're powerful objects, so to say. And then these remains were distributed in 8 groups, we say. So this included basically the king Ajatasattu of Magadha, the emperor after Bimbisara, then the Lichavis of Vaishali, then we have the Shakyas of Kapilavastu, then the Bulis of Allakappa, then the Koliyas of Ramagrama, and after these groups, then we have a Brahmin who came from Vetadipa, they say. This was a single person. And then the 2 more groups, like the Mallas of Pava and Mallas of Kushinara. So the remains were distributed among these 8, you can say, groups. And then the vessel in which the master was cremated was given to Drona, who performed the funeral rites. And the last one, I mean, the Mauryas of the Piprahwa, who came late, so they got only the embers or the charcoal from the funeral pyre. And then these 10 ultimately built memorial tops, stupas, as we call in Sanskrit. In Pali, we call them thupa. So these are memorial mounds in which these are kept and venerated for then several years. It is very interesting that the Buddhist texts, I mean, they talk about the power of these objects. And then also there are some questions raised in the connection of that. There is a text called Milinda Panya, the questions of King Milinda or the Menander, in which there is an issue raised. Now, the Buddhists believe that the master, he left the world completely without any remainder. So he has gone into complete cessation, what we call as parinirvana. So the question is, if he's gone completely, totally, then what is it which can create those miracles, or which will have that power if there are no remainders? So then the next question is, then this funeral, I mean, this worship of the bodily remains, does it have any purpose? Does it serve any purpose? Is it really fruitful? And if the master has gone away, then the worship done to this remains will be useless, will be fruitless. And if the prayer, the worship is fruitful, then we have to assume that the master is there somewhere still, because otherwise you cannot get the result of your worship. And then it is very interesting that the tradition tries to kind of solve this problem, saying that just as even if the fire is extinguished, but if you have the material from which we can create fire, with efforts you can still reproduce it. And in the same way, even though master is gone, but still his bodily remains are there, and they can be objects worshipping which, or paying your reverence to which, you can create the same amount of power, and they can be equally influential. And then we have lots of texts which talk about the influence of this bodily remains. So we have records of this, especially the distribution of these relics. And then later on, we learn that at the time of Ashoka, he took out the relics from different stupas and distributed them in 84,000 stupas or viharas, which he built himself. So that is what is believed, and we can find these stories circulating right from like the 1st century, or right from the 1st century BCE up to the 7th century, the last record which we find in Xuanzang's travelogues. So we have this discussed in Pali text. We have this discussed in the chronicle text in Pali written in Sri Lanka in the 4th century, like Deepavansa, and then the 6th century Mahavansa. We have this recorded in a collection of stories called Divyavadana in Sanskrit, in a text called Ashokavadana. And then we also have records of it in Chinese sources. like the Faishan record or records of Xuanzang. And then we also have this discussed in Tibetan sources, in basically in the translations of some of the Mahaparinibbana Sutra in Tibetan. So you can see that the entire Buddhist tradition, in a way, is really fascinated by this whole issue of worshipping the bodily remains and their power. So these bodily remains, I mean, they serve not only as a memory of the master, but also as a very powerful source of spiritual energy. And this is why we see that, when this Piprahwa relics came in, I mean, there was so much enthusiasm. And now I learned that the government of India is taking it to different places, different countries, and lakhs of people are coming to pay their reverence to this. So even now we can feel that these relics are kind of looked upon with the same reverence and as a source of spiritual energy. And there's always a kind of a wish that we should have some relics. I mean, in Mumbai, in Global Pagoda, which is a close by place built by Acharya S. N. Goenka, there also a part of it, a fraction of it is deposited. And it is believed that when you meditate in surroundings of that kind of area where the bodily remains are there, your practice becomes more powerful. I mean, these are the things which are kind of around the whole issue of the bodily relics of the Buddha. And I think we'll have more on this topic now from our chief speaker. And I'm myself interested because I'm a person of languages, literature, but I would like to hear more from his mouth from the point of view of art history. And it's a very interesting topic. And I hope that all of us will learn a lot from today's lecture. I convey my sincere thanks to Professor Chengalur for inviting me for this talk. Actually, I told him that I'm not someone from the art history, but he said, no, you can talk about something on this topic from a literary point of view or philosophical point of view. So that's why I'm here. So thank you very much once again to all of you and to the organizers for this kind invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Devkar. May I now request Professor Chengalur to present our speaker, Professor Naman Ahuja, with a token of appreciation.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you very much. Okay.
May I now request Professor Vidita Vaidya to kindly felicitate our chief guest, Professor Mahesh Devkar, Dr. Lata Devkar, and our director, Professor Jairam Chengalur.
Oh.
May I now request the other dignitaries on the dais to kindly take their seat in the audience. Professor Ahuja, may I request you to please remain on the stage. And now I invite Professor Vidita Vaidya to introduce the speaker for today's colloquium.
Thank you so much, Professor Devkar, for gracing this occasion. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Naman Parmeshwar Ahuja, Professor of Indian Art and Architecture at JNU, New Delhi, and General Editor of MARG. He's one of India's most influential art historians and curators. His publications, exhibitions, and work in public media juxtapose history to wider contemporary issues, and he has found ways of presenting politically or socially difficult narratives of conflict and inequities on account of gender, caste, and colonialism to a wider public. He's highly respected as a public communicator, and so we're super excited to have him here with us. And he's contributed to diverse initiatives that bring art history to wider audiences. Amongst his most celebrated exhibitions are The Body in Indian Art and Thought, and India and the World, A History in 9 Stories, which created landmark dialogues between objects from the British Museum and collections across India. These exhibitions received major critical acclaim and drew record numbers of visitors. His curatorial and academic work has taken him across the world. He has held visiting professorships at the University of Zurich, the University of Alberta, and at SOAS, which is where he got his doctorate degree. He's guided many students, and his writings are widely considered the core text for students of art history. In 2021, he was appointed as the chief curator of the Lumbini Museum to develop a narrative that commemorates the birthplace of Buddha for a larger viewership of about 1 million visitors annually. Lumbini is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the museum is intended to be a space which will draw on the involvement of several Buddhist countries, as well as work towards the upliftment of communities that inhabit the region. Matters concerning Buddhist art history and the cautions needed when building site museums at archaeologically important religious sites have been raised by him and highlighted in his discussions. His studies on ancient terracottas and small everyday objects examine the foundations of Indian visual aesthetics. His publications and curatorial projects, The Body in Indian Art, The Making of Modern Indian Artist Craftsmen, Gandhara, A Confluence of Cultures, and India and the World, to name a few, have drawn attention to Indian iconography. We're really lucky to have one of his publications with Marg right here with us, and I think this was the first time he actually saw the final version of it, and it's right outside for those of you who are interested. His writings have been variously translated into Hindi, Marathi, French, Spanish, and Dutch. Please join me in welcoming Professor Naman Ahuja to deliver the second Art and Archives Colloquium of TIFR. All yours now.
It's on. I've got my pointer. Slide. Just use. Thank you. Well, thank you all very much. That was very generous. It's lovely to meet friends over here and to be with you all. I'm truly honored, and thank you very much. It's been a bit of a curious journey to think about all of this. And I must begin by first and foremost thanking one of my students, Suhaib Wahab, who sometime in February, March last year rang me up from UPenn, where he's now doing his doctorate, and said to me that, you know, the Piprahwa relics, which you show us in class, when we're talking about the shift towards image worship in India, and what are the material remains that people use for the sake of worship. And I discussed these matters in my classes. He remembered those things from class. He said, well, do you know that they're coming up for sale at Sotheby's in Hong Kong in May 2025? And of course, I didn't know about the matter. And so I began to trawl through the Sotheby's website. And something very startling came up, and which was this video, this promotional video. Let's have a look at it. Is the sound on in the microphones? So the claims are very clear in this promotional video, and they're perfectly aware of the fact that they were selling something which was of enormous sacrality. And that began to cause some amount of discomfiture all over the world, because there were questions of ethics involved. knowing full well that this is the sharir, as we just heard from Professor Deokar, of the Buddha himself, putting bodies on the market was something that is a bit distasteful. And one wondered how this is going to continue and why must it continue? And why is it that we don't have laws that can prevent this from happening? And what will it take to implement such laws and bring them back into circulation? So these questions come back. Is something that I'm going to quickly try and summarize, because we need to deal with other questions in today's talk. So first thing is, for those of you who don't know, these relics were excavated at a place called Piprahwa. Where is Piprahwa, or Piprahwa, as we would correctly say it, or Piprahwa? Within the Buddhist geography of South Asia, where is it to be located? It's located in the extreme heart of the Holy Land of Buddhism, only about 17 kilometers away from a massive excavation at one place called Tilora Kot, which is now in Nepal. About 20 kilometers away in another direction is the sacred grove of Lumbini, and only about, which is where the master is supposed to have been born as the Prince Siddhartha. Kapilvastu is where he is supposed to have grown up. Where is this ancient site of Kapilvastu? Perhaps at the site of Tilora Kot, where they have excavated this massive palace. And it is quite typical that nearby, about 15 to 17 or 20 kilometers away from major capital cities, you have a monastic settlement. So in ancient times, the Shunga capital city was at a place called Vidisha in central India. And about 15, 17 kilometers from it, you have the monastic settlement called Sanchi. In ancient times, you had a massive capital city called Kashi. And about 15, 17 kilometers away from that, you have a place called Sarnath. You have a city called Dharanikot in Andhra, and about a good 15, 20 kilometers away from that again, you have Amaravati. This is the standard operating procedure. And so a massive set of monasteries was excavated at this place called Piprahwa, which abutted a big stupa that looks like this. And this is about 17 kilometers away from the excavations at a place called Tilora Kot. Together, they must constitute the habitations of the ancient city of Kapilvastu, but regrettably, at the creation of the modern Indian nation state, an international border sliced through the urban center, dividing one part of the ancient city in Nepal and putting the other part of the ancient city into India. And the two countries have been sparring ever since, trying to find out as to which one of them is the real home of the Buddha and which one has the legitimate claim to Kapilvastu. Both do, in actual fact. And there is no good reason for us to imagine that the modern international border paid any respect to the way in which sites were originally conceived and where they were spread. Why are the discoveries from the stupa important? And when were these discoveries made? What was there and how was this discovery established? Well, as we just heard from Professor Deokar, I've always wondered whether the Mauryas of Pippaliyana have something to do with this place called Piprahwa that we have at this site. I wonder whether, how these relics ended up at this site. Well, the site was excavated by somebody called William Claxton Pepe in 1898. This William Pepe was the direct descendant of another William Pepe who had participated in the suppression of the 1857 War of Independence. He was given the Jagir, the administration. He became the landlord of this particular area of Basti district near Gorakhpur. And on his land, he dug down into the middle of a stupa, which he carved up in the name of archaeology, slicing through the center of it to a depth of some 17 to 18 feet. And there in the core of this stone, of this brick stupa, you can see the photograph that has been taken, where there is a massive stone cyst or coffer that is being dragged out, that contained within it lots of broken terracotta and wooden vessels that contained cremation ash, along with 5 stone caskets, which contained within them bones and jewels that were then taken away and catalogued and studied and carefully documented, and then carefully documented again, and then carefully documented a third and a fourth time. And so it went, and no one documentation tallied with the previous one. And so establishing a correct corpus and provenance history has now become impossible, because this is like the standard operating procedure in a law case where you have multiple claimants on title, and establishing what is the remit of the property itself is something that is called into question, because you don't have a reliable list. Every list has a different set of components of what it has. So the ground was thoroughly muddied very early on in the late 19th and early 20th century itself. Such investment in muddying the terrain has to happen because of some kind of motive behind it. There can't be such a massive glossing over facts for so many decades unless the matter was of great significance and seriousness. So these are excavation pictures of what I was explaining. So that was the trench that was taken out. That was the stupa that they were carving. This is the massive stone coffer that they pulled out. That's Pepe. Now, several other archaeologists have worked at the site and have written about this material. And then, unfortunately, never talked about. Puran Chand Mukherjee, P.C. Mukherjee, was one of the first really incisive Indian archaeologists to interpret the material. That was followed by renewed excavations that took place through the first half of the 1970s by the government of India, which reopened the stupa and excavated it under K.M. Srivastav, Krishnamohan Srivastav, who went a further 20 feet, even deeper, and found a tunnel that went diagonally down under the core of the stupa to be able to discover another depth at a lower level, deep down in the core, many other terracotta vessels that contained cremation ash, lots of ash. So much ash that it was quite extraordinary that there would be as much ash as there was in this stupa. In fact, that's the strange thing about this stupa, that everything it has revealed is in very substantial quantity. The gems and bones and jewels that came out of this stupa are exactly like the ones we find at many other ancient Buddhist sites, Nalasopara, Girnar, Bodh Gaya, wherever you go, Sarnath. But no stupa has revealed this kind of quantity. And the quantity of ash, too, from this stupa beggars belief, the very large amount. And so this makes it quite interesting. What was also found, along with the ash, were bits of bone and charred rice. Now, rice is always put in at the end of a cremation, and when you're putting it along with the ash, and you have pindadan, and when again ancestors are given rice balls, and so on. And this charred rice, we are given to understand in these Victorian lists that we have found in various archives, were put into glass vials, but the quantity is not weighed. So we don't have exact nowhere do we know how much rice was actually discovered. And strangely, we've not been able to get a proper inventory, and neither has there been any scientific testing of these bits of rice to be able to archaeologically date the material yet, which is very curious. Now, the reason why all of this stupa becomes extremely important and why are we so aware of the fact that this must belong to the Buddha? Because there is an inscription on one of the relic caskets that Pepe discovered. And this inscription reads that this enshrinement, the nidhan, of the corporal remains or sharir of the Buddha, that is the Lord of the Shakyas, is to the credit of the Shakya brothers who are highly famous, together with their sisters, with their sons and their wives. So the paternal bloodline of the Buddha, his paternal cousins, the Shakyas, at the time, as Professor Deokar just mentioned, soon after the Buddha's cremation, 8 sets of kings made claims on his bodily remains and on the cremation remains. A guru by the name of Drona or Dona, it's always a Dronacharya for some reason, whether in Hindu or in Buddhist myth, was given the task of being the executor of this entire operation, and he divided it into 8. One of the portions went to the Shakyas, as we just heard, and the last of the portions went to the Mauryas or one of the Brahmins, we don't know, of Piprahwa, who got the 9th or the 10th portion. I mean, if the 10th portion is the bowl that was used to make the divisions, on which some bits of ash had got trapped in its pores, that was what Dronacharya asked for. Drona asked for as his fee as the executor, and he was allowed to keep that bowl as his relic, for having done the job of being the executor. But the others, this last man who came, took away all the rest of the cremation ash. And perhaps this is what Piprahwa contains, and that's why it has so much ash in it. At any rate, like I said, there are, this inscription makes it clear that this is obviously a very important deposit. And this inscription happens to be in a very early version of Brahmi. It's so early that some people think that it's probably pre-Ashokan, because we've not really seen this kind of Brahmi before. So it might be the oldest known Brahmi inscription, speculatively, because we've got very little to compare it with. So it seems to be a certain version of a very early form of Brahmi that's written there. So paleographically, it is an early deposit. Now, why do we know that these dhatus or these kind of relics are so important in Buddhism? What do Buddhists believe? As we just heard, anything that is charged with the energy of the Buddha is like a magical relic, technically. Now, you see, in Christianity and Catholicism, the business of defining a relic is slightly different. And we can't use the rules of Catholicism to be able to understand what Buddhists believe. There in the Catholic context, you would be able to have any bodily remains would be the remains of that saint charged with the energy of that particular apostle or saint. But in Buddhism, it is something that conjures the aura and the energy of the Buddha that can magically transform your sensibilities. So his teachings have the same capacity. Being in the aura of his bowl or sitting and meditating under that same Bodhi tree under which he meditated has that same capacity to be equally transformative. To pray in the cave in which he once sat might conjure up the sentiment and the emotional register and create the surroundings under which he achieved transformative power. And that you too can have that. So all of these things that can conjure up his presence and energy have that magical capacity of transformation. They are all technically different kinds of relics, whether they are paribhogic or sharirik or uddeshik. And that classification system remains at the heart of what is regarded as having that capacity. So if you have a bit of his cremation ash, you could symbolically charge a stupa in Burma with it, or a stupa in Thailand with it, or you take it away to China. And Xuanzang says that when visitors would come to Gandhara in the 7th century, he witnessed VIP darshan in those days, where he witnessed people would pay a gold coin to be able to beat the queue and come in front of the relics to be able to take darshan. So the darshan, the relics were being monetized in Gandhara in the 7th century. We also have an impression, he says, that if somebody really wanted to see and take away a impression of the relics, and we have texts that tell us that you could take sandalwood paste and make a verisimilitude. You could take a contact relic. You could, in those days, make a molded impression of the relics. And the people who paid 2 gold coins could even take away a sandalwood impression of the relic. And that sandalwood impression of the relic from which Gandhara had, the cranium, a portion of the cranium of the Buddha. If they took away that impression, that they could then use that impression to conjure up the power of the relic that they had. And if it was made of sandalwood, so much the better, because it would be fragrant forever that you would have around you. And you could even use the mold to be able to make new impressions. And so you have the idea of the reproducibility of relics is something that is being tacitly acknowledged in the 7th century, which are critical questions for us today on where we stand with regard to these relics. How do we preserve them in our museums? What is original? What is fake? These are not modern questions. Xuanzang gives us a very good testimony of what was happening by the 7th century. This needs to be kept in mind as we look at these remarkable objects. So I've got over here a few photographs on the screen of a relic casket that was excavated in Gandhara. And you can see how Gandharan relic caskets looked. Just for you to understand that the Piprahwa relic casket is not the only one of this type, all the way in the northwest frontier through to the borders of Burma and Bangladesh. Across the Nepali Tarai, there are dozens and dozens of ancient stupas, and they've all got relic caskets in their core, and they look like this. They have these kinds of things in it. So these are some of the fabulous jewels that came out of the casket at Piprahwa. And why are these relics regarded so magical and important? I'd like to quote a leading Buddhist scholar, Peter Skilling, who's contributed to the volume of Marg, which has just come from the press an hour and a half ago. He writes and says, relics lie at the heart of Buddhist devotion. It is unwise to decontextualize them from the complex and shifting imagination of Buddhist followers over time and space, to try and divorce them from the quest for benefits or from the conceits of empowerment through the possession of special artifacts. It is inexpedient to try and reduce relics to mere material culture by ignoring their rich ritual, liturgical, and metaphysical context, their literary resonance or social practice for such functions as pilgrimage and festivals. Relics are embedded in the ideologies of South Asian Buddhism. They need to be seen in relation to society and to historical needs, rather than boulderize them into some kind of abstracted or freestanding cult. Don't only look at them from the perspective of cult, as you imagine cult to be, in other words. He carries on, the centrality of relics in Buddhism has long been recognized in scholarship. The eminent Indologist, Monier Williams, writing between the difference between Buddhism and Brahmanism in 1889, prior to the discovery of the Piprahwa relics, wrote that for Brahmanism and its offspring Hinduism are wholly opposed to the practice of preserving the ashes, bones, hair, or teeth of deceased persons. However, such individuals may have been revered during their life. And then a few years later, this entry by Monier Williams is updated by Vincent Smith, who writes in the Britannica volume that comes out, where he very clearly states that even ancient Brahmanical culture had a practice of relic veneration. So relic veneration is not something, and samadhi is not something that is only known within Buddhist practice, but it was actually a practice that was also there in ancient Brahmanical religion. So the reason I'm mentioning this colonial record is that it's not a matter that scientific specimens turned holy at some point. The specimens were regarded as and known to be exceptionally holy right from the get-go. When the stupa was carved up, the British establishment was quite aware of the fact that they were dealing with something of exceptionally sacred value. There was no wool being pulled over anyone's eyes about the sacredness of the material concerned, yet taxonomic requirements were great, scientific investigation was needed, and so a different kind of narrative of concealment about the truth of these matters had to be maintained. And indeed, if you look through the archives of the Royal Asiatic Society, of the British Museum and the British Library, in the records of the Victoria and Albert Museum, in the records of the South Asia Archive in Cambridge, in the records of the National Archives in New Delhi, or in the Archaeological Survey of India's extraordinary archives, you will find many annotated file marginal note saying top secret around the files that deal with relics of the Buddha. These file notations make it clear that the colonial government was always aware and even nervous of the religious sensitivity associated with these excavated findings. At any rate, the concern for me as an art historian is that these objects and relics that were kept in our museums were not being taken care of appropriately in our own museums. Research on them and the sites associated with them had been almost absent for the past 80 years in independent India. And it's only really all the books that are being written about this material and research that has been coming out on reliquaries and the relic cult and relic caskets has all been coming out of European universities in the past 80-odd years. So the larger purpose behind my campaign has been to be able to make the public ask, what is it that the Buddha is worth to India, to India's self-image, to India's foreign policy, to the Buddhist and Dalit vote bank, to the National Museum of India, and even to our collective self-identity as a nation? What is the Buddha worth to us? And these are questions that this particular case has been a phenomenal catalyst in being able to bring to public attention. It required no small amount of effort to demonstrate the importance of the subject to the government and bring the matter to public attention. And it began at some point, as I said, with a student alerting me to the material and I writing to the Prime Minister to be able to alert him and his office to the material. And I've got some of that documentation here. And then this was followed by the International Buddhist Confederation of India getting involved, and then the Mahabodhi Society and others in Sri Lanka getting involved. And as this international attention began to grow, what the world was noticing was that the Pepe family's descendants had put a price on these relics, and Sotheby's had been employed to maximize this price. The attempt to sell the relics of the Buddha's body in the bazaar raised several questions in the media about the ethics of this matter. And various Buddhist organizations and Buddhist nations soon got involved. The matter began to be taken notice of by UNESCO. The story given to the media pertinently goaded India to ask if it will turn a blind eye to the commodification of the Buddha. Because the question was asked across the world, the United States, the UK, Sri Lanka, Poland, Germany, Switzerland, and you can see little collages of the world's media attention. So you've got headlines over here in Poland and The Guardian and the New York Times and the BBC and so on. So I've given you a little purview of only a few of the articles that came out on this matter. The question that they were all asking is that how can this commodification take place? And so India had to make its public stance known that it challenged the sale via a legal notice sent to Sotheby's. It stated that ethically, no one can put a price on Buddha's body. The public auction was officially postponed, which was a face-saving way of saying that it had been called off. And now, through a unique and unprecedented public-private partnership with Godrej Industries, the share of the privately held relics have finally been reunited with the ones that were secreted away for the past 128 years in the vaults of the Indian Museum, Kolkata, which are now on public view in an exhibition in Delhi. The exhibition is called The Lotus and the Light. Well designed with some fantastic artifacts. I would recommend it to all of you to please go and see. It's well worth a visit. After marveling at the objects, the more astute visitor can revisit the entire exhibition a second time. And I'd recommend you do so too. Do that too. And ask instead, or think instead, about a different history. One that provokes us to consider what drove that colonial rediscovery of Buddhism, how scientific study has aided the rise of a religious identity via the institution of the museum. Think about that. That has the museum really remained a secular space, or has the museum actually fostered the rise of a religious identity? Had Didi Kosambi Sr. not had the opportunity to visit the great museums of both Gaya and Calcutta, had B.R. Ambedkar not had the opportunity to visit these museums and look at the material that had been preserved in the rediscovery of Buddhism, would we have had the kind of political movements that we have access to today? What role have the museums played in the politicization of religion? How indeed has the scientific study aided the rise of a religious identity via museums, and indeed how a spirit of knowledge gathering and its systems of taxonomy have shifted now to spirituality in the gallery? The transformation is one that I think we all need to think about. The museum is a space for scientific study. It is there to inspire new artists and designers to learn about history. But the museum is now also a space for us to pray. The constituency of Buddhist devotees who come to pray in India's museums is bewildering to those who come to see art, to understand history, to seek inspiration for new design, inform their practice as a dancer or as an artist. You now have to jostle for space alongside somebody who's come to pray. Neither has this opportunity of scientific or aesthetic learning from these objects, however, been saturated. So how then can we privilege one side? Do we still need the scientific study of these relics? Certainly, I think we do. Science is only increasing. It is possibly going to give us much more insight into this diverse array of taxonomical material. The array of material that is kept in the Piprahwa relic caskets is absolutely astonishing. From bits of coral to bits of amethyst to rose quartz to aquamarine to pearls, the likes of which we've never seen before, to stones that are cut and faceted in ways that we have never had the opportunity to understand, go back. They take back the history of Indian gem cutting a good 2,000 years. We had no idea that table cutting and tetrahedrons were even known to people at that time. We were always given to understand, for instance, as students, that Indians didn't believe in cutting and faceting their stones, which was a European influence that comes in the Mughal period into India, because stones in India were only intended to be there for astrological purposes, to be able to keep them therefore stone settings were always to keep them cabochon in order for them to collect light and bring the light via the gemstone into the skin because of its talismanic purpose. And cutting and faceting stones to trap light and emit light back to the audience was all to be able to dazzle the public and make a public statement out of gemstones, which was not the intention we were given to understand. Can't be true. Here you have extraordinary gemstones, and these are not naturally forming crystals. These are faceted. Some of the other crystals that you see here are actually in the form of talismans. They are particular stones which are in the shape of Triratnas or Nandipadas. These three white pearls, I think, actually finally explain to me what the entire motif of a Chintamani is and was. You know, the word Chintamani, the Sanskrit word, doesn't really survive in South Asia but it survives in Turkey, where the Turkic communities took the design symbolism of the Chintamani, of the three white dots with the rose, with the it became a great design pattern in the time of Suleiman the Magnificent in Turkey. And it is one of the core constituents of Islamic art and design. And when you study Turkish art, and of course you ask them what the symbol is, and everyone tells you it's the Chintamani design. And you're just like, now, honestly, how do you know this Sanskrit word of Chintamani in Turkey? Where does this word come from? And what was the Chintamani? And we've heard references to the Chintamani in texts, but we've never known what the symbol of the Chintamani really was. We could call these pearls Triratna 2, these Baroque pearls, which are three pearls fused into one, which you see over there. Quite remarkable object. We found some extraordinary gold discs alongside, which we need special lighting to be able to really study. Extraordinary lighting reveals what the original patterns were. Each of these gemstones require very careful investigation still. They will truly alter a lot of what we know about ancient Buddhist archaeology, about material culture, about the kind of burials that they had at that time, where these burials derive from, what was their connection with older megalithic systems of burial, and so on, which will all be revealed to us only with a scientific investigation of this material. And so that scientific investigation is long pending and much needed. There are people who work on the kind of technology that was used for drilling and faceting. And to know through microscopic analysis, you can actually see the way in which what tools were used. And there are certain tools that were not used after 200 BC. And that makes it evident that these stones were cut and faceted at a very early date. Anyway, the point I was trying to say is, when did Piprahwa's findings turn from specimens to holy relics? And as I was trying to say earlier, that I think that awareness was always there ethically, that they are holy. Academia had to start attending to community rights right from the get-go, because soon after the discovery, only within a week of the discovery of these objects, the prince of Siam, Jinavaravamsha, who was a monk trained in Sri Lanka, came knocking on the door of the Pepe family, asking why a stupa with sacred relics had been opened up. And it's a presumptuous set of questions that he asks. By what right, by whose leave have you opened this up? And what now is being done with it? And how is it that you are making a claim for title on these objects? Who is, in other words, who is the British government to grant you title? Especially after the covenant is discovered, which states that the Shakyas had given it for public benefit. So how do you disregard the Shakya bequest through their charitable agencies and foundation as they created in this stupa 2,500 years earlier, and have that superseded by a government that has just arrived in South Asia under the auspices of the British Crown? Who is this British Crown to grant you this title, in other words? And he writes his letter of complaint as the Prince of Siam to Lord Elgin, and the matter goes up to the Crown in Britain. And very interestingly, a settlement is reached where a quantity of all the bone and ash relics, apparently, of a substantial amount of the bone and ash relics, are handed over 2 or 3 years later in a public ceremony in Thailand, in Bangkok, to the King of Thailand. And the King of Thailand further apportions, makes a further subdivision of this material, and they go to Burma and to Ceylon, where portions are further given to other Buddhist countries for reinterment in Buddhist stupas, and they're brought back into worship there. So the requirement to have these multiple lists becomes quite apparent, because every time what is being divided and what is the corpus from which things are being taken out is always being removed from a new and more whittled down list. A different list is being used for this purpose. And that's quite a nightmare for those who are doing provenance studies, because you can potentially now have all kinds of lost bits of the Piprahwa casket emerging at multiple locations. Now, can all of this colonial presumption be regarded as a kind of violence? And I think perhaps it can, yes. But we also have to be able to contextualize what was going on. And is it only the colonial government that can be blamed for this kind of activity? Or is the Indian sensibility one that is equally to blame? And I think we need to ask this question quite squarely and look ourselves in the mirror as we ask this question. The commodification of relics went alongside the scientific study of antiquities, and this makes this case very complex. This scientific study has aided the rise, on the other hand, in turn, over time, of religious identity and even Indian nationalism. We have now shifted from a spirit of scientific discovery and taxonomy to spirituality. This transformation is an exceptionally important one in history, in an age when received wisdom looks upon progress as the adoption of scientific skepticism, which is secularist in nature and conditioned by scientific rationality. So I think these questions, I think some of this comes up in an array of the books that I've put up on the screen, if anyone's interested in knowing how these things were discovered and who by and what happened. What is the history in India of the previous cases of repatriation of Buddhist relics to India? That is also worth on a little detour for 2 minutes to understand. This is not the first time that Buddhist relics have been repatriated to South Asia. In colonial times itself, in 1938, the government of India had received a request from the Mahabodhi Society of Bombay to bring back the relics of Sariputra and Modgalyana from the Victoria and Albert Museum, London. In 1939, the Indian Museum of what was the Indian Museum of South Kensington, which later became the V&A Museum, decided to return the relics of the Mahabodhi Society to the Mahabodhi Society through an intervention by the Secretary of State for India. However, the transfer of the relics had to be postponed due to the outbreak of World War II. As I was saying, the records of the National Archives, the Ministry of Culture, and the British Library are exceptionally useful in this regard. The relics brought back to India were divided between the National Museum and the Mahabodhi Society. Each party realized the value of what would be enabled by the other party. Historic and scientific specimens had returned because they were holy, and a portion of them were brought back into worship in a new stupa that was built at Sanchi by the Mahabodhi Society. Over time, laws across the world changed, and many museums have had to return their human remains to community elders or to spokespeople of those communities. Why? Well, a small detour into understanding the question of whether relics should be left buried or whether relics should be displayed is something we should think about. Let's look at one of the caskets from which these relics were retrieved. It's spectacular. It's made out of a single fabulous piece of rock crystal, the likes of which, the perfection of which is something that you will seldom find in the world. Absolutely clear, no imperfections that I can detect, no little bits of crystalline cracks and so on in this rock crystal relic casket. The entire lid with its fish finial is not just a tour de force of lapidary skill, but if you look at it carefully, its open mouth is filled with a conglomerate of gold and ash, and it shimmers like the scales of a fish would when you look at it. This relic casket is prized and was taken in antiquity. Why? Because it's made of a material which is absolutely transparent. What does transparency, why would you want a transparent casket? Because you want to be able to see what is inside without touching it. So the visualization of these relics was as important in antiquity as was the case of sensing these relics. Sitting near the stupa in which a bit of them were lying buried, to be able to sense their magical aura was as important as it was to be able to look upon them. So the visual culture of Buddhism is as important as the sensibility of the other sense organs being awakened through the presence of the relics. Let's look at other depictions as well in antiquity, where we see, for instance, in this grand relief on one of the architraves of Sanchi, that they are being paraded on the heads of elephants as they are being taken through a city. You see at the stupa of Dupadu in Andhra Pradesh that a relic casket, rather like the one that we found at Piprahwa, which had the inscription on it, exactly the same one, same shape, has been put on a small chowki or on a small stool in front of a stupa. Clearly for people to be able to come and see what's inside the stupa or what's going to be put back into the stupa at some point. So museums often present relics as artifacts behind glass, and the public has been asking that, is that actually allowed? Is that valid? So I've explained this matter at some length in this Marg issue that's just come out, that the public display of relics is not something new. It's just that the museum now has to allow people to pray or meditate in its precincts. And that alters the functioning and the role of the curator. So the museum, which is a Western institution, needs to adapt to itself to the reality if it's going to continue to house religious objects. And a new definition of what is a museum and what is a museum curator's role and what must a museum director do has to emerge from South Asia, which is a different kind of museum to what we have seen in the rest of the Western world, which is secularist in nature. And perhaps these museums will have to find a new way in South Asia to be able to define museology. Questions on how to keep and display relics remain complex, and the mediatized rise of religion in the public domain makes the matter exceptionally charged now. In such an environment, an object's spiritual merit has often superseded its archaeological significance. The attempts and intentions of curators, artists, historians for edification through science, to study the form and design of an object, to learn about its socio-cultural context via a museum, are sometimes giving way to an emphasis on the religious function of that object, and at times the ritual activities are being brought into a museum. All too frequently, a case is made, therefore, that the museum cannot justify itself as a home for these objects, and demands are being made to reinstate them in shrines instead. The scientific secularism that may once have guided museums has now been recalibrated in an age when history is being deployed in the service of religion. And these relics perform an exceptional source of political power in world history. The photographs that are posted by the Ministry of Culture on its website show all the protocols that are followed when relics are taken by Indian diplomats and by the Indian government to different parts of the world and how they are transported. The two photographs here show how a special aircraft of the Indian Air Force carries relics with full state honors with a cabinet minister in attendance, passing them onto the aircraft and saluting them off. The Home Guards and an entire contingent of the Air Force is always present there. They are present there. And then when they are taken from the airport by the receiving country, they're again treated as a head of state and then ceremonially treated for the period while they are in that, visiting that country, and then brought back to India. Let's think about these other cases, not of the repatriation or returning to India, but what the Emperor Ashoka was doing with relics. He was doing exactly the opposite. He was trying to distribute them all over the place, right? His intention was to send relics as far and wide as he could at that time. He was trying to send some to Egypt, to China, to Tibet, to Sri Lanka, along with his daughter, and so on. Relics were an instrument of geopolitical diplomacy and proselytization that took Buddhism to those lands. We're given to understand wars have been fought in the world over relics. Not in India necessarily so much, but in Western Europe's very historical claim to being the rightful home of Christianity, let's remember, was dependent on bringing into its churches relics of so many of the apostles and saints who had spent their lives being active in places like Jerusalem or Egypt and so on. They created the Knights Templar to fight the Crusades, after all, to be able to bring relics from Africa and West Asia to Western Europe, to France, to the churches of France and Britain, right? So Islam too has had a long history of establishing political authority because leaders have claimed to have relics of the Prophet. What role, after all, did relics play in the circumstances for the rise of the Ottoman state in the 14th, 15th century? It was because they had an unprecedented number of relics of the Prophet. And the Topkapi Sarai today is filled with the largest number of relics. So it's relics that form a very interesting category for governance and for museological authority and for religious authority. So for all that India enables, there is much that it as a custodian needs still to do. And what it needs to do is really think about the protocols that are involved in such a matter. I put it down as a sort of triratna of a set of questions that I think we need to address. The first set of questions that I began to prod the media with in my campaign is the Buddha really homeless in India's National Museum now? What is the fate of the Piprahwa material given to the Kolkata and to the National Museum? Because all the world's media was agog with the Pepe collection being sold by Sotheby's. But the question that needed to be asked is, what was going on with our own collections in the museums of India, which had an equal number, if not more, of these relics from Piprahwa, which had not been shown to the public for the past 127 years. So if we are now bringing these back in a big public ceremony, as I said, this was a catalyst to be able to also get our own house in order. India had gone on to a record to say that it is going to be building the world's largest museum, and it seeks to improve its museum sector. The opportunity of these relics' return can be seen as a catalyst for equipping art historians and museum curators to be keepers of articles of faith. What shifts do these functions necessitate in the field of art historical training for the running of our museums? Now, this gives rise to a second set of questions, which my friends who work in museology and who work in the field of contemporary art might be a little bit more sensitive to. Conflict studies, or rather the representation of histories of conflict, have become essential in modern museological discourse. Museums have become spaces for the commodification of the history of conflict in society. Conflicts over such original relics actually are age-old. Now, you and I may complain about the commodification of art, which we think is a violence. But the commodification of relics and the grave of the Buddha is also rather remarkably something that is age-old. Violence has accompanied such relics in the past, and the communication of the histories of violence has become a necessity in modern curatorial studies. So is that going to be the narrative with which we are going to communicate them in our museums today? Responsibilities and the importance of custodianship is the next set of questions. What kind of a display do such things require? What are the recommendations for global commons and custodianship or trusteeship that bodies like UNESCO need to make a charter on to allow for the governance of such things in the future? We don't have these things in place in India. After all, the UN General Assembly, and I've only put up a few things on the board here, clearly states, and I've underlined it in its declaration, that indigenous people have the rights to use and control their ceremonial objects and the right to the repatriation of their human remains. Further on, I've underlined, it is the United Nations may be called upon to provide redress through effective mechanisms, which include the restitution developed in conjunction with those indigenous peoples with respect to their cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property, taken without their free, prior, and informed consent. It can be done. The UN can help India, but does India have the laws in place to be able to call upon the UN to help it? Regrettably not. So as I said, it's not just the museum sector in India that has not implemented the necessary revisions, but neither have the cultural property laws in India been amended effectively in the past 45 years, as they have been commensurably altered in other parts of the world. And so even if we wanted the help of an international court, we wouldn't be able to solicit their help because we don't have laws in our own country that are equivalent. The Human Tissue Act was implemented by the United Kingdom in 2004. Its section 47, the power to deaccession human remains, was signed by, look at the list of signatories, the Board of Trustees of the Armories, the Trustees of the British Museum, the Trustees of the Imperial War Museum, the Board of Governors of the Museum of London, the Trustees of the National Maritime Museum, the Board of Trustees of the National Museums and Galleries on Merseyside, the Trustees of the Natural History Museum, the Board of the Trustees of the Science Museum, the Board of the Trustees of the Victoria and Albert Museum. They've implemented this law. Are the directors and museums of India taking similar action? Have they implemented similar regulations, at least in their own homes? Not yet. The matter that comes down further in the thing, when I put it in red over here, is that if in relation to any human remains in their collection, it appears to a body to which this section applies that the human remains are mixed or bound up with something other than human remains, then it is to be considered as part and parcel of that same body of the original relic deposit or the funerary grave goods and must be treated as part of that. So these gems, which Sotheby's tried to claim are separate from the bodily bones, does not actually hold water within UK law. So you wonder then why the auction had to be held in China. The jewels of Piprahwa are relics. So what was being talked about, repatriation not of artifacts, but of relics. And relics are governed by laws on sacred human remains. As a result, our Ministry of Culture and Museums need to urgently catch up with the laws on human remains, grave goods, and sacred remains. Now, I've just mentioned a few museums in the UK law, but of course, the Met, Chicago, Harvard, apart from Oxford, the German museums, have all got their laws and their regulations on these matters up on their websites as a matter of public knowledge of what they would do. And the Pitt Rivers Museum of Natural History has got one of the best and most informed, well-informed policies on this. And we certainly need to look at these things to be able to fix our own laws. I've argued previously for the necessary changes to the Antiquities and Art Treasures Act of 1972. Unless this is reformed, we cannot, firstly, salvage and protect the best of India's heritage, nor can we keep pace with the shifts in international laws, or foster public-private partnerships in our museums, or mobilize citizen action and education for the maintenance of heritage, or even develop the necessary confidence in private collectors in the country to be able to aid the government in what it wishes to do without feeling penalized. And so I've got a whole history of sort of writings on this field for the past 20 years. And if anyone who's interested, you're welcome to read some of these recommendations. They never seem to come to much. And so we end up in a curious situation where we have to start finding our own ways of delimiting public-private partnership, which we need to clearly spell out the ethics of. India also needs to change its definition of heritage, of what antiquities are and what role relics and rituals play in its museums. It needs to figure out what are the safe limits of ritual expression that a museum can impose on itself. Today's talk was titled When Scientific Specimens Turn Holy. But I have also discussed what happens and how things that were holy are turned into scientific specimens. This is not just about the colonial presumption which has enabled this, but it is also equally about how the modern mind that does this. Scientific displays, taxonomies based on archaeology of religion, have created religious revival. Where temples may once have been raided to make museums, today India's museums have helped remake religious communities. Scientists must continue to have as much of a stake in the sources of history, and only the humanities cannot have that control. It is contingent on medical and other scientific disciplines to have a thorough engagement with the subjects that archaeologists and the humanities normally do. So this story really matters now. Why is it pertinent for me to raise this in the public domain currently? Because we stand at an important precipice in society, because larger and larger museums are needed to preserve the heritage that's being lost with rampant urbanization and with development. This leads to a certain urgency and a desperation in society. And that desperation is about losing our spiritual heritage, losing our moorings in society. We do not want to prevent science and historical inquiry from being hampered by promoting religiosity in the museum. Each have their role in society, and ethical considerations will become paramount here, lest we mobilize religion against science, or science regards their quests to be greater than those of others. It is absolutely critical to bring greater awareness of who rescued which heritage to the public, so that they can be aware of how and why we have what we do in our museums. Who does a museum display, or what does a museum display benefit? Questions like who made this museum possible, under what considerations, how did the sponsor pay for it, what public service does this tradition or object provide, will immediately make the caretakers of these things aware of how no one person or no one group can claim to speak for heritage. This heritage needs to be accessible to a variety of stakeholders, each of whom have different expectations and investments in it. This allows me to sum up my talk for this afternoon, evening. In the first part of my talk, I talked about how the jewels of Piprahwa are really relics, and what has been repatriated are not artifacts, but relics. This demands a certain urgent shift in their status. As much as the relics of the Buddha hold the promise of ahimsa and peace, they have also occasioned wars in antiquity. Curating history nowadays has to contend as much with narrating violence and conflict as it can hope for ennoblement and grace through the museum. Legend has it that wars were waged for ownership of Buddha's relics in antiquity too. Magical, their possession was regarded talismanic, and even if the pacifism of his Dhamma was not being adhered to. Turning the relics of the Buddha, the greatest preacher of nonviolence, into a commodity to be sold off is symptomatic of the violence of our times. Regrettably, laws on matters related to culture have not been updated in the past few decades on these fronts in India, and our laws are not in step with the best practices internationally. And so I end with this set of very tricky questions in museology, because a museum is ultimately not a temple, and yet its staff needs to be able to deal with such sacred living culture. And so finally, we're going to have to think about what sort of a narrative do we want to use when we display these objects in museums. Are we going to talk about their place in religion, in law, or how their rediscovery enabled the rise of religiously founded nationalist identity? Or should we go further and even admit that if narratives on violence and conflict are essential in museum discourse, then we are now confronted with the commodification of a history of violence? I'd like to thank you all very much for the invitation to be able to consider these questions, which have been no small matter that one has had to contend with in this little volume of Marg. Marg has an important history which came up in this city along with this institution's history. And there was a kind of a air of Renaissance men in this city that actually began to take these matters in hand and look at the progress of science and art and material culture together. If Marg was one end of the spectrum, this institution where I stand today was the other part of it. And they worked together in association to be able to do that. It's an important history to be able to go back to. I think it's a great privilege for me to have been invited to be able to speak to you all over here and bring this matter to your attention. I'd also like to thank very much the trustees of Marg, who make it possible for us to be able to have the funds to be able to bring you a Marg for a mere 500 rupees. It's no joke to be able to bring you a Marg, which costs us a few thousands per unit price sometimes, or at least well over about 1,500 to subsidize it and make it available for the Indian public for a mere 500. I must thank the contributing authors in this volume for the most wonderful conversations I've had with them, but particularly Peter Skilling, Phyllis Granoff, and Michael Willis. To Sohaib Wahab, Gayatri Chittale, Pranita Tripathi, Simran Agarwal, and Malvika Madgulkar, who have all contributed to the research of this volume. Thank you very much. And thank you all very much for being here this evening. Should I sit here? Yeah.
Our heartfelt thanks to Professor Ahuja for such an inspiring, insightful, and truly wonderful lecture. Your clarity of thought, depth of knowledge, and engaging presentations have left us enriched. And it is a privilege to listen to you. And I'm certain that everyone here will carry back your ideas and insights and keep them for a long time. Our heartfelt thanks to the Sir Dorabji Tata Trust for their support to all the activities of TIFR Archives. We are sincerely grateful to all the members of the Art and Archives Committee for their constant guidance, encouragement, and thoughtful support in shaping this event. A very special word of thanks goes to Nilesh, Sagar, and Amit for their dedication, commitment, and tireless hard work behind the scenes. We would also like to acknowledge the support of our Science Communication Officer, Ms. Uzma Sheikh. This event would not have been possible without you all. We also warmly acknowledge the contribution of our student volunteers and extend our appreciation to TIFR security, audiovisual, photography, public relation, catering, cosmetic maintenance, accounts, purchase, stores, computer, and gardening teams for their seamless support and cooperation. And finally, last but certainly not the least, we have this wonderful audience. Your presence, enthusiasm, and engagement are what truly brings these events to life. Thank you for taking out your time to be here with us today. We look forward to welcoming you again more often at future TIFR public and outreach events. Thank you all and have a very pleasant evening. The faculty now. Please join for refreshments. It's there in the cafeteria area.